just a couple weeks away from the motor actually arriving and getting it back in the Z06. But before we do that, there's still quite a few things I need to get done on the car before I'm even ready to install the motor. And the first thing is installing a dry erase board. Dry erase board has absolutely nothing to do with the engine's ability to be installed, but it has everything to do with my ability to install it successfully. So similar to our good buddy Josh Van Velt, I'm sure anyone that watches my channel also has seen his channel. He bought this very long dry erase board here so he can list out all the components and changes that need to be installed back. It's very easy per se in comparison to remove the motor versus putting it back in. So I don't have the extensiveness that Josh had in the sense that his motor came disassembled. It came as a short block. Mine will be a full long block pre-assembled, but that doesn't change the fact that I have quite a bit of work to do. All of the sensors, the harnesses, and there's other things that I want to do to the vehicle while it's in its current standings. That's just going to set the car up for future success. First thing anyone should do is title their to-do list. Vader 2.0. So essentially, before the motor even gets here and I focus on anything installation, I'm going to create a checklist of the remaining items that I want to accomplish before the motor arrives. Essentially, I want the car to get here, I want the motor to get here, and there's absolutely nothing that I am focused on outside of getting the motor installed and figuring it out. Which means, to do so effectively, I still have a couple things to do. One is DEI wire starter. Currently, my starter wire's heat shielding has been cooked in a couple areas, and I don't like that. I don't want the hot start conditions, so I bought some DEI wire sleeves that I'm going to install on that area. The next area is I'm going to DEI wire the dry sump lines. This is essentially just a nice to have, try to help mitigate temperatures on the dry sump lines. They already come with, again, factory sleeving. I'm just going to add the tape in this area just to beef it up a little bit per se. The next bigger items on the list is slave cylinder install. Now, when we pulled the engine out, it was getting late, we were getting a little tired, and we were a little aggressive with how we were separating the engine from the transmission, or the torque tube better said, and we technically took a nice hit at the slave cylinder. So fortunately, my good buddy Craig has every part known to man and an extra part of that at his home garage, and gave me his brand new slave cylinder that's only got about 5,000–6,000 miles on it. We're going to swap that out. We are going to use the Monster billet bearing support that this transmission already had on it, so we got to swap that out onto his slave cylinder. I don't know what I mean by slave cylinder install because that'll be part of the process, and we're going to get that slave back on the car. Now, when we pulled the motor, we chose the path of more resistance instead of least resistance, which was leaving the steering rack in the car. The problem with leaving the steering rack in the car and having an ATI harmonic balancer is clearance was a huge issue in pulling the motor out, and we essentially had to remove the bell housing from the motor so we can get more clearance. I'm going to put the bell housing back on before the motor arrives so I can reconnect the motor right onto the bell housing when the motor gets back. That's obviously after the slave cylinder is reinstalled on the car. I'll probably relume where the remote bleeder's at, organize that while I'm in that general area. What else do we got? We have to, that's going to essentially speak for the under the hood compartment area. The rest of the stuff is not necessarily going to impact the installation of the motor, but like I said, I don't want to deal with anything when that motor's there. I don't want to be worrying about, okay, the engine's in, now I got to do this, now I got to do that. I want everything else to be done. All these parts I got sitting on my parts counter here need to be on the car. So the next one is AMT diff mount. Now, we are going with AMT engine mounts and diff mount. The engine mount obviously has to wait for the engine to be here. Not really concerned with that one, but I do want to get the diff mount out of the way and installed and not worry about it. I do have also something I've had here for months, maybe even a year now, is Z01 add-on tie down brackets. So essentially, since I run a 19-inch, it's not really so much about the diameter of the wheel, but the width. I run a 12.5 wide in the rear. When I load onto the trailer, I can't wrap the strap around the rim correctly, and I got to tie it around a spoke. I don't like doing that and applying pressure to the wheel's spokes like that. So these Z01 tie down brackets allow me not only to properly cross strap the rear end of the car, it also allows me to not have to use the rims as a place to strap the car down to. So while I'm here for doing this, this is all in the same subframe area, so I'll go ahead and install those as well. I also have the AMT camber kit. And I have Spiegler, sorry for botching the name, brake lines. And I'm going to do all of this when I do what I didn't do on the removal, which is remove steering rack. This time, I want to make it easy on the guys that come out of their way, you know, leave their families and stuff to spend all that time with me to help me work on this car. I don't want to make it complicated for them, so I'm going to pull the steering rack. And when I do that, since I'll be in the steering and suspension area, I will work on the AMT camber kit. And I think probably the Spiegler lines I'll leave to the very end. I think I mentioned in a previous video, when you have the steering and when you have the suspension kind of sagging, you're tugging on the brake lines. I rather it tug on the factory one since I know I'm going to replace them and deal with that after. But I will put the rear ones on for sure at that point. So we got quite a bit to do. These are just the ones I can think of off the top of my head. I will personally come back out here and write these. My goal is within the next couple of weeks to knock this out so we don't have to worry about it when the engine is here. First things on our list is DEI reflective tape. We're not talking about politics. We're talking about this tape right here. It's basically a heat resistant reflective tape that people use. They use them on the air intake tubes. They'll use it on wiring harnesses. I'm going to use it on the dry sump lines to try to mitigate some of the heat coming from there. Again, this is not a must do or anything like that. They do come factory wrapped, but I'm going to wrap this a little bit more, maybe drop a temp or two while on track, because naturally you want your oil temps to get to a certain temp, but you don't want them to get too high, you know, to mitigate, you know, any issues with the oil breakdown. So if I can drop a temp or two and keep a higher viscosity oil in it, I'm going to do it. So let's get this thing wrapped. Said they already, you can see they have this factory taping job done, but missing most of it at this point. So, and this one has absolutely none. So we're just going to wrap this up, tape it up, because as you can see, the plastic will start cooking through. You might not see it on camera, but the plastic starts to cook through. It does get hot, does rubs next to the headers, next to the oil, obviously communicating with the oil pan. So let's wrap this up, give it a little bit more protection. Finally, at the meat and potatoes of why you clicked on this video, which is the AMT differential mounts or transaxle, whatever you want to call it, and the AMT camber kit for the C6 Z06. We have our long laundry list of things we want to get done, and this is probably one of the more important ones. Again, can you do this with the motor in the car? Absolutely, because the motor is not getting in the way of any of this. But I figured I got some downtime, the motor's not here, the car is just kind of sitting in the garage. let's get this stuff out of the way. So once again, once the motor gets here, that's all I'm focused on. Is getting the car, the engine installed, getting it running, getting the bugs out of the system, and getting right back out on track. So let's go ahead, let's jump into it. Obviously, we saw a little bit of the earlier on video. Now let's get to what you guys clicked on this video for. One video I did find on the C6 diff mounts, the gentleman in the video had to essentially loosen the control arms and loosen the rear subframe. You can loosen the rear subframe, but the control arms are connected to it, so essentially the subframe won't drop. Now I'm the kind of guy that loves to essentially cut corners with removing the least amount of parts possible whenever I'm working on anything. I am going to, for science purposes, try to just jack the rear diff up while the car is up in the air and see if it gives me enough room to get my hand in there and take out the stock ones. If I get the factory ones out, I can most definitely get the AMTs in because they're a little bit smaller. But I don't know. I don't know if it's going to work. So let's just go ahead and jack this thing up and see what happens. Bolts are too long to clear. Okay, so the science experiment failed. I have the diff pretty much essentially jacked all the way up where it's now trying to push the car body up. And I still don't have enough clearance to get the mount out. So we're gonna start unbolting the subframe, give it some slack. I'm not taking the bolts completely off. I'm just giving it some slack. Now the control arms are also connected to the subframe, which are connected to the body of the car or the chassis. So we do have to loosen the control arms. If not, the subframe will not drop. So while I'm at it, camber kit will also be worked into this process now. I went ahead and I loosened all 4 subframe bolts. And the subframe did lower maybe 1/4 of an inch, if that. Oh wow, it lowered a lot more than that. But unfortunately, in Corvette's line of work, we still got to go more. So this is a part where I'm going to have to loosen the control arms to give the subframe more give. Which is totally fine. I do have a jack right here. Let's start lowering control arms. I'm doing everything with hand tool. All right, they're both out. Well, one's out, and you can see the AMT one right next to it. It was actually in good shape, but you can kind of tell size-wise they're much different. This is obviously completely solid versus this highly rubber. So we're going to go ahead and install this one on the driver's side, and then we'll work on the passenger side, and we'll be done with these mounts. All right, so the driver's side is done. Technically going to move on to the passenger side. I originally did not jack up the rear diff evenly. So the driver's side had plenty of clearance. Passenger side, not as much. Oh, the car's already lifting. What the hell? Looks like the passenger side is going to give me a bit more of a fight than the driver's side did. All right. I'm going to have to keep going up, see what happens. I'm nowhere near where I need to be. There's number 1, and number 2 is also in place. We've just got to lower the diff now into place so we can actually tighten the bolts. So essentially every bolt's got to go to 45 pounds. That's what we're working on now. Got her. So the rear diff mounts, the Vulcan AMT mounts are installed. Some things I didn't mention is, for starters, my engine's obviously out, so my exhaust is disconnected, but you will actually have to remove or disconnect the axle back so you can get more clearance, because essentially the exhaust flows right over those mounts, and it's really a pain in the rear on the driver's side. The passenger side, at least for my case, was a lot easier to do. I was able to just use a long neck 15-inch wrench and back out the bolts. The AMTs should be torqued down to 45 foot-pounds, and essentially you do have to, obviously for science, I try to just take a shortcut and lift the rear diff without loosening the subframe bolts. That didn't work. The diff does move quite a bit, but there's still not enough play to get the AMT, to get the factory mounts out. Now, you got a grinder, you could cut the bolts and probably only get away with just doing that and pull the mount out, because the AMTs, the bolts are movable. Like, you can remove them and stuff like that, so you have a lot more clearance, a lot more play. So you can get away with that, just cutting the bolts, pulling it out with just lifting the rear diff. But honestly, if you don't want to do that, you loosen the 4 bolts on the subframe. You don't take them off. You just back them out a little bit, let the subframe sag some on there. You do want to kind of put some support there to not put all the pressure on the bolts. And then if you need to. Now, I loosened my control arms very little, and I kind of stopped when I saw the subframe was already starting to sag. So I didn't really like back my control arms completely out. I didn't need that kind of clearance. So kind of go and take each one, pace by pace, and kind of see what happens. We're going to move on to doing the camber kit now on the car, also from AMT. But you guys are going to have to wait till the next video. So make sure you like and subscribe for part 2, which will be the AMT camber kit installed. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.